Hare Krishna. In this video, I'll be talking about chapter 2nd of Bhagavad Gita in brief, uh, so that it gives you a summary of the yoga of knowledge. And anyone who is interested, one should read this. This is 72 verses in which Lord has provided extensive details about the nature of self, the nature of Brahman, the nature of individual soul, the nature of our body, who we are, who we are not, what is this delusion all about, why we are in ignorance, and what is the way to get out of this ignorance. So, if you look at this chapter, Yoga of Knowledge, the objective of Yoga of Knowledge is very clear, which Lord speaks in the last verse 72. And he says, our ultimate objective is to reside in Brahman. And that's the only way to destroy the delusion or ignorance and to regain the knowledge. So, destruction of ignorance is possible only by dwelling in Brahman, which is called Brahma Nirvana. So, Lord talks about this objective in the last verse, verse 72. And before that, he talks about what is the nature of our life. He talks about what conditions are ideal to arrive at this state. He talks about what conditions are obstructions to arrive at this state. He talks about how we should conduct our life in this world, how we should act, and he talks about how we should meditate. He talks about all this. He gives a very comprehensive view of what one should do, one should not do, what is the nature of our senses, nature of our mind, and how to arrive at the state of Brahma Nirvana so that our ignorance is destroyed and we realize our true nature. So Lord starts about talking about who we are. Usually we identify ourselves with our body, and Lord tells Arjuna, hey Arjuna, we are not the body. Our body goes through many phases of life. It goes through the birth, it goes through childhood, it goes through adulthood, it ultimately dies. And then the embodied soul takes another new body. He says the soul that passed through all these different bodies is never destroyed. It is eternal, it's unborn. It takes on new bodies. But what changes all the time is the body. It goes through various phases. It takes birth, it goes through many stages of life, and ultimately it dies. So he says there is no point grieving about it, because death is not the death of the soul, it is the death of the body. And the eternal soul takes up a new body. So there is no point in grieving about the death of the body. So that's the first thing he says. And second thing then he says that what is the nature of our sense? He says to gain knowledge or to arrive at that state of Brahma Nirvana, what is absolutely essential is equanimity of mind. And what is impediment to that equanimity of mind is the mind's obsession about the sense objects. So when the mind thinks about sensory objects, whether the object of sight, object of hearing, the worldly object, when the mind thinks about sensory objects of this world, then those objects become more and more powerful and they start attracting our mind. away. So mind thinks about a particular picture, about a particular person, thinks all the time about that person, then that person become more and more and more attractive to the mind, and ultimately our mind always dwells in that particular person, dwells in our mind. And this contemplation or thinking of sensory object is detrimental because it creates turbulence inside the mind. So he says a person who is capable of withdrawing his mind, just like a tortoise withdraws its limbs, is perfectly capable of staying in the state of equanimity. Lord calls him Sthita Prajna, whose knowledge is settled, whose mind is settled, his mind is calm. He's saying such person never get disturbed by favorable or unfavorable circumstances, because circumstances in life all the time constantly changes. So to arrive at that state where the mind remains stable, doesn't get disturbed, we have to make sure that we don't allow our sense, our mind to constantly dwell on worldly objects. So that's one thing that Lord emphasizes on. Do not make your mind think about worldly objects all of the time. In that way, what happens? Those objects draws our mind away and our mind becomes turbulent. So that's a very, very important one. The second thing the Lord says, which is helpful, is how to act in this world. He's saying desireless action, or when one is acting, one should not be too much attached to the consequence of action. The fruits of the action causes disturbance in the mind. When man is too much attached to the outcome, the fruits of the action. So he's saying we should practice a detachment to the fruit of action. We should be focused on the action, detached from the fruits of action. And when we are acting, we should always be in a state of yoga, contemplating about the Lord, contemplating about the divine, and acting, doing our duty. If you are a student, you should study hard. If you are if you're working in this world, you should put all your efforts trying to do the work, but not all the time being obsessed about what the outcome is going to be. That attachment to the outcome of your action causes disturbance in the mind. The mind becomes turbulent. So he gives here two very important pointers, or two very important techniques, what will help to calm down our mind. And then he says there are three things here. One is body. We are always identify our body. Instead of identifying with our body, we should realize that we are immortal souls. We take many bodies, we come through many births and deaths, but we do not die. There is no death to the soul. So the individual being never dies, even the body dies. It goes through the process of birth and death. And the delusion that we die is because of the ignorance of our true self, true nature. And how that ignorance gets destroyed? It gets destroyed by Brahma Nirvana, or by union with Brahman. All pervading Brahman. He talks about that cosmic self, not the individual soul, the cosmic self, which is source of everything. And he says that pervades everything. It is forever the same. It never changes. Nitya Sarvagata Sthanur Achalayam Sanatan. He says that's the nature of the self. It's forever the same. It's eternal. It's all pervading. And by union with that self, cosmic self or Brahman, one attains to the state of Brahma Nirvana. In that particular state, one's delusion of one's true nature is destroyed. So the ignorance is destroyed, one realizes one's true nature. And that's the ultimate objective. Lord has given many beautiful verses in this, and All these verses will help us to understand how exactly one should practice. Lord is talking about how to act. He also talks about how to meditate. He's saying few things, few pointers which are very, very important here. The first thing he says that one should act with detachment. That creates some equanimity in our mind. He's saying equanimity is very, very essential. That's the foundation. Second thing, he talks about devotion. He's saying one should always be devoted to the Lord who dwells within the heart. So equanimity, devotion, detachment from the sensory objects, not contemplative about sensory objects, trying to stay away from them. These are the things one should practice. And ultimately, by equanimity and devotion to the Lord in the heart of the being, one will arrive at Brahma Nirvana, the state in which the delusion is destroyed, the ignorance is destroyed, and one realizes one's true nature, that one is an immortal soul and one never dies. And that is the perfect state, the state of bliss, the state of pure joy. So, this is knowledge. This is the yoga of knowledge that Lord has spoken about in verse 2 of Bhagavat Gita. It's a very, very beautiful verse. It's only 72 verses of that particular chapter. It's a lovely chapter. So please read it. It is so wonderful. So wonderful, and the verses are so beautiful. And verses describes the nature of reality so beautifully that you will enjoy it. So I try to give you a summary of it so that it creates an interest in you. So that way you read it and you realize that it is an invitation by the Lord to each and every one of us to practice it. Hare Krishna.